Picture the scene, the whole camp, out in the middle of the desert, and the children of Israel are on the ground, sobbing, going straight at Moses. Not because of a bandit raid, not because they're lost, not because the water ran out, but because of food. And interestingly, and maybe frustratingly, from Moses' point of view, by the time this scene happens, God has already parted an entire sea for these people. He's already flattened Pharaoh's army in it. He's feeding them daily with actual bread that falls out of the sky on a schedule, enough for everyone every single morning without anyone working. And they are on the ground crying anyway. Put yourself in Moses' shoes. Bro must have thought, who are these bunch of ungrateful bozos? You see, this was genuinely in the text, and it might be the single most confusing scene in the entire Exodus story. A nation that just watched an ocean split in half, weeping, as a group, over produce. So here's the actual question, and it's not, was the manna bad? The real question is, what was on the menu back in Egypt as slaves that was good enough to make free people walking toward an actual homeland, fed by an actual miracle, still want it back? Let's start with what the job site actually looked like, because slave labor is doing a lot of lifting in most retellings and almost none of the specifics. Exodus doesn't soften it. Their lives were made bitter with hard labor, mixing mortar, hauling brick, working the fields, mortar, brick, field work. 3 different job categories. In Bronze Age org chart terms, Pharaoh wasn't running one bad workplace. He was running an entire forced labor conglomerate with departments. And it had output targets. The text says outright they were forced to build storage cities for Pharaoh, Pithom, and Ramses, grain silos basically, on an industrial scale, which becomes darkly funny in about 4 minutes, so hang on to that, and then it gets pettier. Exodus 5, production's slipping, so Pharaoh doesn't hire more workers or extend the deadline. He cuts the straw supply. No more straw handed out. Go gather your own, but the brick count stays exactly the same, not 1 brick fewer. Same quota, half the materials. Go find your own straw on your own time, and if the count's short tomorrow, that's your problem, not ours. Somewhere, a modern productivity consultant is taking notes, and this is where the text does something most retelling skip completely. It shows you the appeal. The Israelite foreman, the guys personally responsible for hitting the number, go straight to Pharaoh. Face to face. Why do you deal this way with your servants? No straw is given to your servants, and they tell us, make brick. And behold, your servants are beaten, but the fault is in your own people. That's not a vague complaint. That's a specific chain of command grievance formally raised to the actual person who could fix it. And Pharaoh's answer is the part that should make your skin crawl a little. You are idle. You are idle. Therefore you say, let us go and sacrifice to Yahweh. Go therefore now and work, for no straw shall be given to you, yet you shall deliver the same number of bricks. Translation, in Bronze Age org chart terms. You're not overworked, you're lazy. And the fact that you're asking for relief proves it. Somewhere, a modern productivity consultant is now taking notes on this too, and honestly, a little concerned about himself. Okay, but hold on. I hear someone going, isn't this just like generic ancient tyrant stuff? Every king and every old story is mean to somebody. Doesn't mean any of it actually happened this way. Fair. Except we don't just have to take the Bible's word for this one. The Egyptians wrote some of it down themselves. There's a real administrative document, cataloged today as Papyrus Leiden 348, and buried in a routine supply order is this exact line. Issue grain to the men of the army and the Apiru who are drawing stone for the great pylon of Ramesses. Apiru, a term scholars have debated for decades, and I want to be honest, the connection isn't proven. But a lot of historians think it's linguistically related to the word Hebrew. So somewhere in an Egyptian scribe's ordinary paperwork, filed alongside army supply requests, is a grain order for a group of foreign laborers dragging stone for one of Ramesses' monuments. We can't say with certainty that's them, but it's the closest thing to an Egyptian receipt for Exodus 5 that actually survives, and almost nobody outside academic circles has ever heard of it. Egyptian sources backing up the Bible won. So brutal hours, quota-based, materials cut out from under them, management that gaslights you for asking, and if that papyrus really is describing the same people, a grain ration substantial enough that somebody bothered writing it into the official record. What's the actual menu on a day like that? We don't have direct payroll records for Hebrew brick slaves specifically. Nobody was handing them itemized receipts. But we do have real ones for real Egyptian laborers from roughly the same era and region, and they're stupidly specific. At a workers' village called Deir el Medina, skilled craftsmen were paid monthly in 300 liters of wheat and 110 liters of barley. Standard laborers got a car and a half of barley a month. Fish crews delivered, sit with this number, about 250 kilograms of fish per crew per month into the ration system. Bread and beer were the two staples of the entire diet, and yes, beer, given to children as regular food, because it was thick, nutritious, and barely alcoholic, which is either the best or worst parenting fact in this entire video, and I genuinely cannot decide. We even know roughly how they made it. A researcher named Delwyn Samuel spent years studying leftover residue under a scanning electron microscope from an actual excavated brewery at a workers' village called Amarna and reconstructed a real two-stage process. One batch of grain mixed cold to activate its own enzymes, a second batch cooked hot, combined and fermented with harvested yeast. That's not a guess. That's a lab-verified recipe pulled out of 3,000-year-old crusted residue, which is either the coolest or most disgusting sentence I've written this month. Quick, honest aside, because I promised myself I wouldn't let a fake fact slide into this video, just because it's the version everyone's heard. You've probably also heard that Herodotus found an inscription on the Great Pyramid listing exactly how many onions and garlic and radishes were bought to feed the builders. Great story. Also, according to actual historians looking at the claim, almost certainly wrong, either Egyptian priests fed Herodotus nonsense because they knew he couldn't read hieroglyphics, or he mistranslated what was probably a list of offerings for a dead king, not a grocery bill for construction workers. So no, we don't actually have Herodotus's onion receipt. What we do have from a completely different and much better source is real evidence that garlic specifically was handed out to laborers doing heavy work. Not from a shaky Greek tourist story, but from the Ebers Papyrus, a genuine Egyptian medical text from around 1550 BC listing over 800 remedies, which prescribes garlic for strength, circulation, and stamina. Exactly the thing you'd hand a crew hauling stone all day. Same rumor, wrong source, fixed with a real one. Egyptian sources backing up the Bible too. And remember those storage cities from earlier, Pithom and Ramses, the ones they were literally forced to build? Archaeologists have actually found them. Ramesses's real city, buried under a modern Egyptian town called Kontir, got mapped out with ground-penetrating radar. And at the other candidate site, Tel El Ridabe, they've dug up exactly what the name promised. Storage facilities and granaries from the same 19th dynasty period, which means if the geography lines up the way most scholars think it does, the Israelites may have spent years building the literal grain silos that other people's rations came out of, without necessarily getting to eat from them the same way. Egyptian sources backing up the Bible 3, and this one has a GPS location, and here's how seriously that ration system was taken by the people who were fully inside it. About a century after the era most scholars associate with the Exodus, those same Deir el Medina workers didn't just complain about their food, they walked off the job over it. Their rations arrived late, they'd had enough, and they staged a sit-in right there at the royal necropolis, refusing to work until they got paid. Historians widely consider it the first recorded labor strike in human history, and the only reason we know about it at all is a scribe named Amenacht who wrote the whole thing down on papyrus, presumably while personally furious. Keep that in your back pocket, because you're about to watch a much bigger group of Egyptian laborers do something almost identical over their own food supply. That's the real diet underneath the bricks: bread, beer, fish, grain, measured, rationed, and absolutely nobody's idea of a good time. But real, documented, and consistent enough that it's the best reconstruction we've got for what a forced laborer in that world. And that era was actually putting in his body every single day. And here's the thing that should already be nagging you. That's the food they missed. And it's not even the first time they say it. Way back in Exodus 16, barely a month after walking out of Egypt, before manna has even shown up, they're already saying it, telling Moses they'd rather have died back in Egypt sitting by full pots of meat, eating all the bread they wanted, than starve out here free. Not, we were slaves and it was awful. We sat by the meat pots and ate our fill. Then chapters later, once manna's old news, the exact same complaint resurfaces in Numbers 11, same energy as our opening scene, except now it's gotten an itemized list attached. The free fish, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. This isn't a single bad day of homesickness. It's the same grievance filed twice, months apart, getting more specific each time, like someone rehearsing a complaint until it sounds airtight enough to bring to HR. Because that's not a memory of oppression, that's a memory of a decent Tuesday lunch. Somewhere between forced brick quotas and a Red Sea walking dry. The version of Egypt that survived in their heads, quietly edited out the overseers and kept the produce section. That's the modern equivalent of someone missing their old, terrible job specifically for the free snacks in the break room. And none of it was random. Every single item on that list existed in Egypt specifically because the Egyptians had engineered it to. The Nile flooded on a schedule, and Egyptian farmers built canals, dikes, and reservoirs to catch that flood and stretch it across the growing season, which is the entire reason cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic weren't a luxury. They were just what reliably grew there year after year because the water supply had been made predictable by hand. And onions specifically weren't just food, they were practically a national symbol. There's an old saying that the pyramids themselves were built on nothing more than bread, beer, and onions. And Egyptians treated the onions' layers as a symbol of eternal life. Onions have been found placed over the eyes, ears, and chest of mummified bodies, and King Ramses IV, an actual pharaoh, was found with real onions still sitting in his eye sockets thousands of years after burial, which is either a beautiful spiritual tradition or the worst possible thing to discover when you unwrap a mummy, and I refuse to pick a side. So when the Israelites say they miss onions, they're not just naming a vegetable, they're naming the one crop the entire civilization around them had turned into a symbol of never actually dying. And what were they trading it for? Manna, which the text goes out of its way to describe with actual sensory details, small, white, shaped like a coriander seed. And this is the part that makes the complaint almost absurd, tasting like a honey wafer. There were even rules built around it that read less like ancient religious law and more like a genuinely well-run supply chain. 1 omer a person exactly, no more, no less, however many people were in your tent. Try to hoard extra overnight, and by morning it had bred worms and gone foul enough that Moses was, in the text's own words, angry about it, which, historically speaking, is the single most relatable thing Moses does in the entire Torah. The one exception was the day before the Sabbath, when everyone gathered double, and that batch stayed perfectly fine overnight. No worms, no rot. So this isn't just food fell from the sky neat. It's a portioned, self-regulating system that punished hoarding and rewarded exactly one kind of forward planning. And they are standing in front of that daily, still asking Moses if there's any way to get the old rations back. Overseer included, apparently, if that's what it takes. It gets worse before it gets honest. God answers the second complaint with quail, more meat than anyone could reasonably want, falling by the camp for a day's journey in every direction. And while the meat is still, in the text's own phrase, between their teeth, judgment hits the camp. They bury the dead there and name the place Kibroth Hatava, literally, the graves of craving. Not the graves of hunger, the graves of wanting something they didn't actually need badly enough to die complaining about it. A nation that just watched Pharaoh's entire army get swallowed by the sea laid to rest, generation by generation, over a produce order they'd apparently been rehearsing since chapter 16. That's really what this whole video's been circling. Not what did slaves eat as a trivia question. It's the much stranger fact that memory doesn't file trauma and comfort in separate folders. It files them together, and when things get hard enough in the present, people don't always reach for their best memory of the past. Sometimes they reach for whatever memory still has food attached to it, overseer included. The Deir el Medina workers walked off the job when their rations were late. The Israelites walked toward a homeland and still tried to walk back into bondage, twice in writing. For the exact same reason the food was reliable, and reliable, it turns out, beats miraculous almost every single time. And this generation isn't even the last word on it. Centuries later, whoever wrote Psalm 106 looked all the way back at this exact story, the craving, the quail, the graves, and landed on one line colder than anything in Exodus or Numbers themselves. He gave them their request, but sent leanness into their soul. Not he punished them, not he refused them. He gave them exactly what they asked for, and it hollowed them out anyway. That's not a throwaway poetic flourish. That's a psalmist, generations removed from the desert, reading the same grain rations and the same graves we just walked through, and concluding that getting your cravings satisfied and actually being fed are two completely different things. So next time somebody tells you manna sounds like a downgrade, no, it tasted like honey. They just missed the onions more, filed the complaint twice, and it eventually cost some of them a grave with their own craving carved into its name, and a psalm, centuries later, still using it as the go-to example of getting exactly what you wanted and feeling worse for it. If you want the next uncomfortable detail dug out of the text, subscribe. There's more sitting in plain sight than anyone tells you at church.